The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that results from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. I'm Max George.
I'm Nathaniel Darkish.
And I'm Chiara Amato. By commission of the Library of Congress, to make assay of the secular folk, podcasts of West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, including the Mississippi River Valley and the Ozark Mountains.
Okay, well, welcome back. We are here with a very exciting text today that we're going to be digging into. We don't get to get into a lot of the horror literature nearly as much as I usually want, so I'm very excited to talk about a horror book. And we also have a wonderful guest, as you heard, Chiara Amato, who has been on the podcast before, which means that we need to kick things off first by knighting her. Then we'll have her talk a little bit more about, who she is and her horror bona fides.
So upon this day, the 3rd of April, in the year of our Lord 2022, Chiara Amato, we knight thee a Scream Duchess.
I feel so honored in this moment.
Chiara, we are super good friends. We started working together a few years back. We went to London together, and that really solidified our relationship together. But you were an exciting guest we had on episode 22, which was the Great Alien Debate. We had you and another friend on, and we kind of talked about the existence of extraterrestrials, if they exist, if they don't exist, and some of the evidence as to why. So being in the know of aliens, Chiara, can you give us like an update on where we're at in the world of extraterrestrials?
Yeah, what's new in the world of UFOs and alien life?
Okay, well, I know everybody is probably sick to death of hearing about the Oscar slap, but I read the most ridiculous news article today that apparently, according to a former official with Britain's Ministry of Defense, alien life forms that happen to tune into the Oscars could have divisive thoughts about humans acting that way, especially because apparently aliens will know. I'm not sure how they will know, but they will know Will Smith already from Independence Day. And apparently he punched out an alien in that movie. And then also, he has his role in Men in Black. So according to this former official, Smith's role in Men in Black could suggest to aliens that Smith is one of the planet's primary defenders.
Oh my lord.
So aliens apparently are keeping a close eye on Will Smith. And, I don't know, this Oscars thing could have bigger ripples than we even knew across the universe.
The fate of our galaxy was in the hand that slapped Chris Rock.
It's just wild times out there.
It's true, though. I think maybe in this case, it's just solidifying that he just greets most people by punching or slapping them. And so maybe it just recontextualizes Independence Day in a much more positive light.
Except for now, I'm worried that if aliens come to Earth, they're going to think that's our custom for people we like.
Yeah, just slap them right across the face.
And we're going to get a lot of alien slaps and punches.
Hey, better that than, getting shot.
Or probed.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to yuck anyone's yum.
Speaking of cosmic horror, Nathaniel, you kind of gave us a nice little intro about what we'll be talking about today. And I know you're very excited, and
yes.
So am I, so is Chiara. We're going to be talking about a book called A Lush and Seething Hell. It has such a wonderful title.
Right.
Every time I see the book just laying around my house, I just smile a little, because what an incredible title name.
Yes, it is. Yes, A Lush and Seething Hell, which just sounds so like it feels nice on the tongue. By John Hornor Jacobs, who
Jingleheimer Schmidt. I can't say his name without saying Jingleheimer Schmidt.
Well, now you will never be able to get him on because you have just ostracized him in such a way. No, we're going to say lots of very positive things about this. So hopefully, if you ever happen to hear this, Mr. Jacobs, we love your work. Even if Max keeps adding Jingleheimer Schmidt to your name.
So Nathaniel, you talked about this book on one of our previous episodes, and it sounded so fascinating that recording, I actually went to Amazon and bought the book as we were wrapping up the episode. And then I think I posted it to my Instagram story. And is that where you saw it, Chiara, and bought the book as well?
Yes, I saw it. I think I bought it before I even told you that I got it. And then it was just off to the races.
Yeah, so this book, a lot of like the themes that we're going to be talking about, it's kind of, I don't know, it's made ripples. I saw it on a TikTok video about like top 10 horror books. It's kind of making the rounds, I feel like. Nathaniel, you called it before it even started, so way to go.
Well, to be fair, it has also been kind of making the rounds. Like that's how it came into my orbit was just I kept seeing little references to it all over horror Twitter and on Goodreads, which I'm absurdly active on. If anyone follows me on Goodreads, I apologize for how many updates you'll see from me because I read so freaking much. But yeah, it's just been kind of been one of those ones that has been gaining a lot of traction in the horror community. I think especially among a lot of horror writers, where people these other writers are reading it and just going, oh, this prose is just redonkulous.
Yeah. And before we get into that, because really the prose was hypnotic, let's kind of clarify though, it is two separate novellas.
Yes.
The first novella is The Sea Dreams Is the Sky, and then the second one is My Heart Struck Sorrow.
Both
That's what we're going to do.
Bangers of names.
Absolutely. And very indicative of kind of the prose that we were talking about. There's a way that this author kind of speaks to us that is very enticing and captivating, but also sinister to some extent. But anyway, what we want to do is kind of break down each story and actually rate them separately. Because while it is one book, there are two stories to be told here. And the reason we have Chiara on is, Chiara, you and I were essentially live texting as we were reading this book. You ate it up. Do you want to give us, just kind of some of your superficial thoughts that you had as you were reading this book as to why you wanted to come on to the podcast?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you both kind of mentioned this. The prose is so good. I would say it's decadent. I don't know. I mean, aside from before getting into kind of what each one is about, you know how sometimes you read books and there's words that you don't know and you're just like, oh man, the author got a little crazy with the thesaurus here. When I had to look up so many words when reading these books, and I think I mentioned this before we started recording, I would consider myself to have a pretty big vocabulary, but I had to look up so many words, and instead of feeling like this was a pretentious word choice, I would look it up and be like, yes, this is the only word that could have described what he was trying to say. Like I said, I think the prose is super decadent in that way. It just kind of sucks you in.
Decadent is such a good word, though, because you usually associate decadence, with some sort of rich food that you're eating and it's just so delicious and intriguing. But also at the same time, if you have too much of it, it can get a little nauseating.
Yeah.
And that's what this book did in a way, that you wanted to keep eating this decadent treat, but you knew your stomach was going to hurt because of it, in a way.
Your brain stomach.
Your brain stomach.
Gotta pull out the brain tums at the end of the day. Yeah, you're so right. it kind of, as you were saying that, reminded me of The Witch with Black Phillip. Like, would thou like to live deliciously?
Ooh.
It's kind of like that same, I don't know, it's so good, but has that darkness in it. Yeah, but both stories, the first one is such a grand cosmic scale story. Both of these tales are so different. I think overall my comments are about the way that he wrote. I think in the foreword, the person who wrote the foreword talked about being jealous of how Jacobs wrote these stories, and I agree. Like, I'm not much of a writer, but I am jealous that I am not the person who came up with these and then put them to paper.
Yeah, that's a great intro into kind of talking about the first of the book. Nathaniel, anything you want to say before we dive into the sea that dreams it is the sky?
No, I mean, it's just, other than that, this book has made me a lifelong fan of John Hornor Jacobs. Like, I'm gonna read everything this dude has ever written now, because just good criminy. Like, his ability to weave a tale and also to just put words on the page that are like you nailed it. It's not just that his diction is very intelligent and sometimes obscure, but it's always perfect. And just like the way, like the analogies that he came up with, all of the figurative language, it was a feast for me, a writer, an English teacher. Like, it scratched an itch in my brain that almost no other book has, or very few other books have. It's the kind of thing that only a handful of authors really, I think, pull off at that level. And he's going to be one to watch for the rest of his natural life in terms of his writing. So let's get into the specific stories though.
All right, so the first novella that we're going to talk about is the first one that appears in the book, of course. The Sea Dreams Is the Sky. And kind of the harkening back to what Chiara was just saying, the foreword for both of these stories is that it's setting the scene for cosmic horror, which to me kind of resonates with what Lovecraft would write. These horror fictions that kind of have this slow descent into insanity almost, where you start kind of blurring the lines of what's really happening and what's in the minds of the characters. So The Sea Dreams Is the Sky is about a young college student who meets this mysterious man who's known as the Eye. He's kind of a local legend in the town. They develop this budding friendship, and ultimately he goes to this fictional country that is beset in war, and he asks... In South America, thank you. And he asks this college student to kind of take care of his house, and she's a literary student, so she can read his materials. And ultimately what we start to find out is he was part of some of these guerrilla prisoner of war situations in this country he's returned to. But in particular, he's uncovering this kind of cryptic story alongside these very graphic, sadistic, pornographic, fetishized pictures that start to kind of unravel this weird mental tale between these two characters. His descent into madness and her chasing after that descent. And that's a very quick Spark Notes version of it all. The first story, I believe, is well over 200 pages or so. Yeah.
And I just kind of wanted to add that, the Eye was, I guess, like the most beloved poet from this, fictional South American country, but, was exiled when this, dictatorship regime took over. And so him going back is this really dangerous move. And so, that's, part of the interesting thing is that, they were expatriates from their, home country. I think they were living in Spain, right? And them going back is, going into the jaws of a dragon, basically. Like, it's super dangerous. It is a bad place to be. But this mystery is so strong and so compelling that that's what pulls them there, which, definitely is, I think, a great example of kind of how this story knows its inspirational source material. When we're looking at any cosmic horror, right, we usually look to Lovecraft or some of his contemporaries as kind of the pinnacle of kind of like what defines that genre. And what I really liked about this is that like we have these characters that do a good job of kind of fitting that mold, but also sort of reinterpreting it. Because, if of course, Lovecraft, for example, was very notoriously very racist and very sexist. And so I like that in some ways the Eye and our main character, kind of fit within the roles of Lovecraft's work in terms of like they're scholars, they're writers, which are, the kinds of characters that we see in a lot of Lovecraft stories. But like they're not white. They are, our main character is a woman, and like, it's kind of cool to see how, while having characters that both kind of fit that traditional role, they also break from it, which really just makes it an even cooler exploration of, what cosmic horror can do, while still using a lot of those classic conventions.
Yeah, and I think kind of this plot of this first novella really, it's kind of a trickle of a burn, and when I was first reading it, I was like, okay, the story's good, but I'm not grappled yet. I'm not captivated by it. And then all of a sudden we start to find Isabel looking through these secret manuscripts about the profane work and this kind of evocation of something unholy or cosmic. And then she, essentially loses her life and goes to this war-torn country to try and find the Eye. And eventually I couldn't put it down, and this was kind of where the start of John Hornor's prose really started captivating me. The way he writes, Chiara, you nailed it on the head. It feels like Black Phillip talking to you. Kind of this savory, decadent kind of prose that just lulls you into a false sense of security, and then something terrifying happens, and it just kind of poisons you a little bit in a good way. It's hard to describe almost.
It is, and I think it's interesting. I took I noted down a couple things from examples from the text, and one of the things is that they kept talking about was the sweet miasma of pain. And it's interesting because that also kind of has those food connotations. And there's a line right after that talks about that we are bits of meat in a watery broth. And that also is kind of that food idea. So it's interesting that overall, without making that connection until just now, it feels very food related. And we've used a lot of food related words to describe it, and even within the text, even though it's gross things like you were talking about before, it's still referred to in those kind of edible terms.
Another facet of this first novella that I really liked is just our main characters. We have the Eye, who is kind of this local legend in the town of being this mysterious author who fell from grace, so to speak.
Who has one eye.
True. And Isabel as well. She's a queer individual. She starts off the story dating another, female. And she's a college student trying to get her education and going through life, and she encounters this life-changing individual, and it feels very relatable, at least it did for me. Who of us weren't that plucky college student who found their mentor in college and then in some way started to idolize them? It feels very much like that in this novella, excuse me. And the Eye himself, he's enigmatic, he's mysterious, but he's also engaging, and he teaches Isabel about kind of the sinister nature of a lot of film and literature, and it's kind of this weird dynamic, really, where you have this mysterious, spooky teacher and this plucky young college student, And the dynamic between them, for me, in the first novella was really deep. I thought that their characters were very realized. It didn't feel contrived. And I cared quite a bit for both characters separately, and then also their motivation together. Isabel's attempt to try and find the eye at the end of the story.
Yeah, and I think it would be really easy for their relationship to seem kind of predatory, given the age difference and the fact that she does kind of idolize him a bit. And I really like that they didn't go there at all, because like you said, I cared about both the characters, and I think it made sense given the relationship that they'd built that Isabel went to look for him when he disappeared. And it wasn't out of any kind of misguided romance or anything like that. I liked that wasn't a part of it.
Yeah, it wasn't kind of that weird taboo teacher-student relationship that exists in media, right?
Yeah, we didn't have hot for teacher.
Yeah. It was an actual relationship that exists in the world. My college mentor, I still talk to her and we have very engaging conversation. And that's an impactful relationship in my life. So having that set up in this first novella really made me care for both characters. And then you mix in all of the horror thematics into everything. These like cryptic, morbid writings and photos that don't really have any sort of an explanation, but they're just twisted, and there's stuff about blood play and scat play and all this taboo stuff that you don't really read or talk about, and how that is messing with Isabel's mind and making her kind of question the Eye's motivations and intentions, and then ultimately his safety. What's going on here?
Yeah, and along those lines, I also really liked that the mystery, was very threatening all the way through.
Yes, yeah,
yeah. That when she was traveling through, I think was the fictional country called Madeira.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. So as she's traveling through Madeira and she's trying to, put together where he could possibly be, and she's visiting these different homes and traveling the countryside and all of that. One, she was coming upon these scenes where, people had been tortured. She's not just finding these horrible texts, but also finding, people post-torture and all of that, just, these corpses. And she has these weird, vague, menacing government agents that are following her around, and all of that, just really makes that threat omnipresent. And then the interesting thing is that the big bad, the real terror of the story is so much worse than any of those things. We were scared for her safety the whole way through, but then once we get to kind of the conclusion of the story, it's so much bigger and weirder and more upsetting than anything that, any threat that a torturer or a, South American dictator could usually throw at somebody.
Yeah, and I think the pacing of that all was really thought out and, again, realistic. It started out as kind of a kindling, and then the fire lit, and it got bigger, and it got bigger, and it got bigger until the climax of the book, where you are faced with kind of this cosmic presence. And the antagonist, like you said, Nathaniel, is just so much bigger than anything we could ever think. But scattered into that journey, there are some amazing horror elements. One of my favorite parts was the creepy old grandma who Isabel finds, and it's like this weird granny who used to run an orphanage, if I recall correctly, and she has this giant tree in the front yard that has shoes, like children's shoes, tied to it. It felt very Baba Yaga meets modern day. It was creepy. Chiara, you have a note about the grandma. What did you think?
I loved her. I think, so what happened, she'd had several children that had died, and then out of kind of cruelty, I guess, people in her village would bring shoes, of little feet. Her kids' little feet never got to wear shoes that walked and things like that. So when she was ready, she would dip them in red paint and then put a fortune inside, and it kind of seemed like the fortunes that she put inside the shoes were just kind of based on her own whims, but it wasn't anything kind about it. She would just kind of write things and leave it to the parents to puzzle out or fret over. And one of the things that I liked is they describe her as Jacobs describes her as having tons of wrinkles. And at first, Isabel thinks that they're perhaps laugh lines, and then the old woman makes a face, and she realizes that they weren't laugh lines at all. It was like this deep-seated hatred, and I thought that was really interesting because, I don't know, I think with people like Baba Yaga, I tend to want to humanize them a little bit, and I liked that this old woman was just a mean old woman. And one of my favorite parts, too, is, which I thought was really relatable, is that this old lady gives Isabel her fortune, and it's not a very nice fortune. And I think in kind of a, the way you feel when you're young and headstrong, Isabel wanted to give the old lady a rude fortune back. And she says something to the effect that you're going to die alone and you won't feel death's release and soon you'll be forgotten, which I think she intended to come across as just mean and cruel and spiteful, and the old lady just laughed at her and everybody's forgotten. Nobody knows release. And I thought that was an interesting dynamic because I think that as a young person, we tend to think that we know a lot, and all it takes is, some well-placed words from an older person to put us in our place.
Yeah, there's all these great, very human moments woven in. And also, I feel like this story does some really brilliant stuff with the setting. I feel like Madeira felt like a real place. A horrifying place, but certainly it felt very real in a lot of ways. I like the way that the culture was played with. Community was played with. All of these themes were really interesting and relatable, and just, I don't know, it just felt like there was so much wisdom in this story. And, kind of interestingly enough, one of the big things that I think this story was doing, wasn't just playing with cosmic horror tropes and storytelling methods. It was also using, kind of South American magical realism as well. And just the way that it kind of blended those two and created this, place in South America that is, that doesn't exist, but is just the most cruel, most broken version of any South American culture was so powerful. And I just loved it.
I really liked the backdrop of civil unrest. And it's interesting, too, because you have this character that Cleve, who the eye kind of thinks in his interactions with him that he's part of the CIA. He's American, and Cleve kind of lets him believe that, even though he's an agent of darkness, I guess you could say.
An eldritch horror.
Yes, and I think that kind of makes you think, right? Because historically, America has kind of dabbled, perhaps where they shouldn't, in South American politics and
understatement much.
Yeah, I know. I was very much an understatement. So it was kind of this thing where it made you consider, oh my gosh, if this was real life, any instance of civil unrest across the world, what if it was part of something like this, part of a calling to an eldritch horror, and that agents of chaos, who people believe belong to different organizations, could just be going and manipulating events to kind of bring this eldritch horror to life.
I mean, you just have continued to describe the CIA, so.
Oh, man.
I pictured that agent. I'm a big X-Files fan, and I absolutely pictured him as Krychek from the X-Files. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
Not as familiar as I ought to be, but I think I know who you're talking about.
Putting everything that we've talked about aside, when I was reading this book, once Isabel left to go to Madeira, I could not put it down. It was this weird sense, almost, I don't want to use the word addiction, because that is very hyperbolic. But Chiara, I think you and I both were reading it at the same time. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning. We just could not stop. It just pulled me in. And for the next few days, I kind of started seeing weird things out of my periphery. I'm sure I was just, my subconscious was still focused on this book and the story it was telling, but I felt like things were outside my window at night, or I'd hear something very benign and my brain would turn it into something very big and scary. One night in particular, there was a weed or a bramble outside of my window, and it was windy, and it was kind of brushing on my window. And I immediately thought there was some sort of animal or human outside my window looking in, trying to get in. And what I'm getting at here is this book created a level of dread that I have not encountered in any other horror fiction book. Probably the closest I've gotten to the same sort of feeling was The Exorcist. And that is only towards the end of the book. A large majority of The Exorcist is actually rather tame. There are very short moments of that book that are very intense, but a majority of it, rather benign. And so this book causing me to do that, it was similar to Hereditary in some extent of it follows you. It sticks with you. And even now there are like noises in my house that are going off, and I feel my body start to kind of get hyper aware of those sounds. My upstairs neighbors creaking and stepping around. And that to me is a testament and power to this first novella for me, is talking about it, is summoning that primal fear inside me. And I don't know, it's such a good read. It will scare the shit out of you. It's good.
It really is. It made me, there's this one part where, Cleve starts to materialize in Spain before she's gone to Megara, and there's a cat that the eye has told her to feed for her own protection, and until that moment it's been a very minor character, but when this dark figure starts to materialize, it stands sentry and the figure dissipates, and never have I ever been more glad to have a cat, because I agree. It almost felt like you said that reading it was summoning like feelings of dread within you, but I felt like I had to read it and I had to finish, but by reading it I was somehow summoning the eldritch cosmic horror that was in this book, and I couldn't stop.
Yeah, I agree.
You're just describing the experience of being a protagonist in a cosmic horror story. So if it makes you feel that way, then clearly he knows what he's doing.
So as far as cons go, I did want a little bit more explanation. I know it's cosmic horror, it's very Lovecraftian, it's very kind of insane, and a lot of the unknown is very important when it comes to these types of stories.
Yes.
But you know me, I'm the occultist, I'm the demoniac. I wanted to know where these ancient texts were from and what purpose they served and what would they summon and which eldritch god in particular was in Madeira, and I just wanted more because I loved this story so much. And then I also, thinking back on it, I do feel the ending was incredibly climactic and poetic, but kind of the wrap-up, the very end of the story did deflate a little bit for me. And I wonder if that is kind of an element to cosmic horror, because the second book did this for me, but like put a bad taste in my mouth. Nathaniel, can you shed some light on that? Is that kind of a component of cosmic horror? Kind of a softer landing at the end?
Yes and no. I would say if we are going to have, basically, if we know what happens to our main character, then yeah, it usually just kind of pans out and it's like, oh, and they're, insane, or they were never heard from again, but they're sometimes seen wandering the woods or whatever. And so, like, this did fit that kind of tradition. I would say, more often, a lot of times, the cosmic horror I've read tends to just end with, oh no, madness, and then suddenly, like, it's over, and you don't really know what happens next, but you assume that the whole world gets consumed or something. But, yeah, just the nature of kind of, I guess, her being able to face the madness and then get rid of it by plucking out her eye was almost a counter spell, and unfortunately at that point it just kind of does feel a little flat, just because it feels almost too easy. But it was also like perfectly set up, like from the very beginning with the I character, that he did the same thing, and so I didn't feel dissatisfied, but I kind of did. it like he set it up perfectly, but I still kind of wanted a little bit more, just a teeny bit more answers, or a teeny bit more, I don't know, earth-shattering repercussions.
I agree. I think, it ends with her plucking out her eye, and then the eye's work where he writes about his experiences is called Below, Behind, Beneath, Between. And so when she plucks out her eye and she kind of goes in this in-between space, I feel like that would have been a really clean way to end it. And that's, ambiguous, but I think that would leave it open to me to maybe think that perhaps, although she saw the eye's dead body, maybe he was still somehow there in that between spot. Mm-hmm. I think that the epilogue is what kind of deflated it for me, because, obviously she was fine. Yeah. I think that a more ambiguous ending would have been a little bit more, I don't know, magical.
Yeah, I agree.
So wrapping up, Chiara, I'm sure you're aware, but we like to rate movies and kind of horror content that we talk about on the show with crowns and screams. Crowns ranging from 0 to 10, 10 being perfection and 0 being,
Birdemic.
Halloween Kills, or whatever that terrible show is.
I thought you were going to say Malignant, and I was going to fight you.
Oh, yeah, Malignant's up there too. Well, down there on the Crown side.
Yes.
So as far as crowns go, I gave it an 8. I loved it. The ending was good. I don't know why I won't rate it higher. There's something in me, though, that's saying an 8 is like perfection for me. It was a good read. It was a fun read. Where it was a novella, I think that may play a part into it. I can't really tell why I'm not willing to give this a higher rating.
I gave it an 8 as well. I really loved it. But yeah, there was just something that didn't quite just make me absolutely smitten with this particular novella, but we'll get into the one that I am just head over heels for in a minute. So, Chiara?
I'm over here, I would say 9.5. I think I mentioned the last time that I was on that I read a lot of Stephen King, and I think that this was really refreshing to me. It was a totally different horror voice. I loved it. I liked that it was a shorter novella. I was really impressed at how fleshed out everything felt for a shorter novel. The only reason I would even knock off half a point is because I feel like there are a lot of people in my life that I can't recommend this to, which is, nothing against that, but I don't know if I could be like, Mom, read this. And that's my only downside to that. But other than that, I absolutely adored this, and any cons or critiques I had for it are just totally outshone by how much I loved it. In fact, before we go on to the next part, can I read that part from that poem? I think I screenshotted it when we were reading it together, Max.
Let's rate it screams first, and then we'll conclude with the horror decadence that you have for us. So Screams, I gave it a 9. This book got to me. It's getting to me right now just talking about the dumb thing. It summons something for me in a very kind of twisted and dark level. And I don't know, I gave it a 9. It scares me. It still scares me. There are bumps going on upstairs, and they keep making me like jump and twitch. So it's scary.
7 for me. I really, really dug it. I felt like it was very scary at parts. I just wouldn't have minded a little bit more. There were just a few parts that felt slower in terms of the horror. But, still, 7 is a pretty freaking scary book. Chiara?
I think I would also say 9. I haven't read a ton of cosmic horror, and so this kind of lit that fire within me that makes me want to read more in that shivery kind of way. Like sitting here, I have a cat. It's good. He's guarding, but I still feel kind of nervous and shaky inside. I love that.
Let's make us all shake and nervous further with your quote.
Okay, so this is from a translation from the Latin text, which was called A Little Night Work, which is such a benign name for such a horrific collection of terrible things. But there's one poem the I translates, and it's called On the Miasma of Soldiers and the Beacon of Cruelty. And there's this part in it that is just so, I don't know, it creeps me out, but I love it. I can't stop thinking it. I almost want to like chant it to myself, which also creeps me out. But
also probably not a great idea to chant something that, you know, brings all of this dread and existential fear into our life.
But it really sticks with you. And I think this will kind of lead into the next one too, because it's a similar idea of something sticking with you. But it goes, blood calls to blood, bad calls to bad, and through pain and sacrifice we draw the gaze of hidden eyes, of titanic movements beyond the stars.
Yeah, I love that. And if we want to like break it down on an occult level, you know, when you talk about energy, you know, if you want to talk to demons or to summon demons, you have to kind of meet them on their level. Bad draws to bad, blood draws to blood. It's kind of this back and forth calling of darkness.
It is, which is terrifying when you put it like that.
Well, let's talk about more demons then.
Yeah.
Or the lack of demons.
What? No. Okay.
All right, Nathaniel, you want to move on to this next novella? Give us a rundown real quick.
Okay, so My Heart Struck Sorrow. So, to kind of briefly summarize this piece, this is following a man named Cromwell. He is a folklorist, and basically when a woman that he was in contact with dies, she allows him and his department at a university to go and basically and listen to a bunch of music that are, you know, on these like ancient acetate recordings, and also, you know, read the writings of a previous folklorist who was going through the South, basically looking for folk music. And specifically, he was really obsessed with one song in particular called either Staggerly or Stackily. It kind of referred to it as both names. But
do we have this folklorist's name on hand, Nathaniel?
It is... Oh, God.
Harlan Parker.
There we go.
Yes, yeah. Just because I think it's important to keep these two folklorists like
distinct.
Separate. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, Parker is obsessed with this one song because of like something related to the death of his mother, and so he is going and, you know, and he's collecting these songs, and he's hired by the Library of Congress to do all of this. But, you know, whenever he does this, you know, the one that he really wants people to perform is whatever version of Staggerly that they have. And there's something about this song that is evil. Like, it seems like it is either, you know, telling the story about a man who, like, he's a murderer, he is put to death, and then when he dies and goes to hell, if we have some of the really more extended versions of the song, he kills the devil in hell and becomes, you know, kind of the new devil. And it's this, you know, kind of really interesting story where, you know, as he gets closer and closer to this story, weirder and weirder things happen. he starts to be kind of pulled into, just like relationships or just meeting people who are aware of the power of the song, and many people are afraid of it. And so, some people will refuse to perform it, or some people will play things that are connected to it, and that also will be hypnotic, and suddenly, like, I don't know, he'll wake up and the building's on fire, and their car's destroyed, and his friend is gone, and things like that. And so it's just, trying to solve this mystery. And so, we have our modern day folklorist, Cromwell, trying to, make sense of all of this, while Harlan, as he's reading and listening to Harlan Parker. And so he's becoming obsessed with Harlan Parker's obsession. And it's just this, I don't know, fascinating, terrifying story. I am so in love with this story.
Yeah, and I think we should definitely kind of lean in first to the prose of the story, because to be, like, transparent here, you really enjoyed this story.
Yeah.
Chiara and I really didn't enjoy this story, so the difference of opinion here is going to be really interesting, I think, as we dive into a lot of the different reasons why we did and didn't like. So for me, again, as a demoniac, whatever you want to call it, I think that's actually the term used for someone who is possessed.
Yes, it is.
Which might be true. That's fine. This is a classic tale of kind of that Faustian bargain with Mephistopheles, right?
Yep.
The Stack of Lee song represents the origin of blues and jazz music. This subculture that existed in America that everyone thought was very dark and taboo because it was African American. It was the slave culture. And so this white dominance projected a lot of this satanic overtone to it all that really just has no place. And what I really liked about this story is it made me think quite a bit about the founder of blues music, you could say, Robert Johnson, who was a black man living in the South. And the story goes that he was kind of this womanizer, deadbeat. He couldn't go anywhere with his music. And then all of the sudden, overnight, he could play the guitar like nobody else. And this myth started to arise. Well, he's African American, so the only way that could have happened is he must have made a deal with the devil. And you get this whole idea of the crossroads and Mephistopheles, or the African god of the crossroads and death, Legba. And it just is this very convoluted story that is so integral into jazz and blues music that a lot of us don't quite understand. That there's a lot of, surprise, surprise, America, systemic and internal racism that gave us a lot of this art. And the idea of Stackerly, Staggerly, and the origin of it and how it's evolved through time, and it means something to different races, it means something to different families. That, to me, was so poetic as far as a sociological viewpoint of demonology and the sociology of demons as a whole. That, I'm under the opinion that demons are a projection of our subconscious, our negative energy. We're projecting that to create a tulpa, to create some sort of metaphor to explain away all of our, wicked behavior. I sound like I'm very esoteric and philosophical right now, but to get to kind of the point that I'm trying to make is this story is about racism. It is about kind of the white interpretation of this Satan story and how it is evil. All right, and that's my soapbox. Chiara, Nathaniel, take it away.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say the story is about racism, because I think one of the problems that I had with it is I think Cromwell is intensely unlikable.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because as a white man who has kind of this same exact role as Harlan Parker, I think he sees himself as Harlan Parker, and he's had a similar tragedy in his life. Like, he's recently lost his wife and his baby. And I think that as he's reading Parker's journal, he is getting from it something totally different than what was perhaps meant to be gotten from it. And I do like that parallel aspect, and Jacobs does talk quite a bit about how Cromwell, is kind of stuck on that line, like there's no endings, only beginnings. And I think that kind of like leads into the fact that he sees himself as a Parker, but it's just so interesting that you have such a rich historical backdrop and Cromwell is uninterested in any of that.
Yeah, Cromwell is a very selfish character. Can we just get that out on the front page? I did not feel any sort of compassion to his blight and his situation. He'd cheated on his wife with another, employee at this Library of Congress situation, and I found myself just not interested in the book when we went to modern day. This was also problematic with Hattie. Chiara, do you want to just seethe about Hattie with us for a minute?
Yeah, so Hattie, she has a lot of thoughts about the whole endeavor, about their opinions. When I say there, I mean, Parker initially, but then also I think she's kind of wrapping up Cromwell in that, about their opinions of women, about how the fact that they are recording people to be played for white people is very exploitative. And also she talks a lot about how Parker seems to kind of be more performative in his respect for Black people. So I guess my issue with Hattie is I can't tell if Hattie's opinion is her own as a character, or if Jacobs is using her to tell us that we failed to pick up on these little nuances, which kind of bothers me, because I want to be able to pick up on those things, and if it's kind of me being spoon-fed that there's a problem with the way that he's seeing things, then I don't like that as much as if Hattie has come to these conclusions on her own as a character that's real and alive in this story, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I know we've kind of devolved into kind of what we didn't like, some of the aspects there. So let's maybe rewind a little bit. Nathaniel, give us a synopsis as why you think this story was so good. You rated it really high.
Yes, I did. So to me, what I found wonderful about this story, one, the way that it looked at folklore and how folklore is kind of collected and shifts, and just kind of the nature of trying to even understand a single piece of art, and how everyone has their own interpretation and their own version of it and things like that, was just utterly fascinating to me. I don't know. I think in another life, if I wasn't a teacher and a writer, I would be a folklorist. I find this kind of thing utterly just super, super engaging.
And to cut in here a little bit too, I did think of you while I was reading about what these folklorists were doing. Mm-hmm. I think it's really fun to read a story, a literary story about the Library of Congress. Why have we not had more of that? This documenting of history by authors, for authors, or whatever you want to call it. That to me was this is Nathaniel's dream job here, to go around the country and find old manuscripts and old stories and archive them.
Yeah. And so when I was in college, I took a post 9/11 literature class, and part of what was so interesting about it was that the class was looking at 9/11, like we had to study the event, we had to study the 9/11 Commissioner's Report, we had to memorize the names of the terrorists, everything. It was very intense in that respect. We also looked at kind of our own personal experiences with 9/11, and also there is at Utah State, where I went, in their library they had a folklore collection of people's recollections of 9/11. Some people that were there, other people just talking about that day. And so being able to look at one event and how every person was interpreting it differently, and we had the hard facts version versus what everyone's individual experiences were, and being able to study those, and then study literature that kind of played with all of those ideas and themes and all of that was just one of the best things I've ever done in my education. And so, having a story that deals with those ideas and presents it in such a way that that feels very organic and interesting, and also shows how imperfectly we try to make sense of history. I agree that at times, going back or going to Hattie, and how kind of on the nose she was with a lot of her critiques. I felt like the ideas that she was bringing up, the way that she was kind of challenging, her counterpart Cromwell was really refreshing, because I think a lot of times we look at something like folklore or a moment in history and we look at the perspectives that we can seem like, oh, I understand it so well. And then just having someone else just say, no, you don't. You're looking at it through one lens, not many lenses, or, it's the white man's version of, looking at black music. That was interesting, and I think worth pointing out that, all of this is way more complicated than it, appears on the surface. So I love that too. But I agree, like, some of the ways that she was delivering her points was a little bit too on the nose. Yes, that's a great way to put it.
And I think if she had been more present, if we'd gotten to see her a little bit more in the present time, it wouldn't have felt quite as shoehorned maybe to me, because you make a good point. I have to confess that until Hattie brought some things up, maybe I didn't see them that way either. Specifically with the way that she talked about women, which is interesting given that I am a woman. So I do agree that it's nice to have that foil there. I just maybe wish that she had been a more prominent character. So I would have, I don't know, taken her more as a serious part of the story instead of just kind of like this side character that's there like flippy in words to tell you things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you both bring up really good points, and it kind of solidifies in some regard my opinion of this story as well, though, because Nathaniel, a lot of what you were talking about, it wasn't necessarily about the horror or the plot of the story. It felt like you were more focused on kind of the more holistic nature of what was going on, and the deep understanding of folklore and how it started and where it's going. So correct me if I'm wrong here, though. That's just kind of what I gathered from your explanation.
No.
Is you were more attracted to what its message was about folklore than you were to the horror elements of it.
I'll say that was what attracted me first. But when the horror elements came in, they punched hard.
The 2 punches.
No, see, to me, okay.
Yeah, sorry for the sass, but this is a huge issue I have with the second part.
That's fine. We had very different experiences.
True.
And like, I think part of it too is like the different places we've lived maybe can inform stuff. Like you have spent time in South America, so maybe that's part of why that made you connect more with that first story. I spent time in the South.
Nathaniel, that is a brilliant insight. I completely overlooked that.
And so, like, I think, there are certain things that are going to make us drawn more to one story than the other. What I liked also, so I'm going to dig into a few more literary elements before I get into the horror, because I don't get to talk about those that much on the podcast. So I felt like one thing that this story did very brilliantly was it showed us the personalities and voices of these characters. Specifically Cromwell and Parker were so fleshed out to me. Like, I hated Cromwell too, but that was the point. Cromwell was, so dislikable and so frustrating and so full of himself. And I think that's part of maybe why we didn't see as much of Hattie, is because Cromwell is, the end-all, be-all folklorist, and Hattie was there as a formality in his mind. And so I think that was a deliberate choice, for the author to kind of reduce Hattie because Cromwell is the viewpoint character and Cromwell doesn't take her seriously. But especially Parker, his narrative voice was very authentic and engaging, and it was really fascinating to also see his voice through two different lenses. One, just the moments of the recordings and the little snippets we get of him, kind of asking people questions or kind of coaching them through making these recordings, and then seeing his journal and how that kind of provides a lot of context for what we have in the recordings. And so even having one character's voice in two different contexts was really good for me.
And to be fair, I really enjoyed reading the Harlan Parker moments, especially in the beginning, in the middle of the book. I thought his voice and his prose were just on par with the first novella. He was a much more likable character than Harlan, and I think that was, in some regard, intentional. Cromwell, excuse me.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think what Cromwell does in this story is that he provides a foil to Parker, both in terms of like their personalities and their like sincerity and even like their reasons for doing the things that they're doing. That they have commonality in terms of like, hey, I mean, they're folklorists. That's a very specific job, but their attitudes towards what they're studying and why they're studying it and all of that are very different in a lot of ways. And also, I feel like Cromwell's story kind of serves as a foil for Parker's story because we have this very kind of modern thing and this one that is set in a very specific period of time, and we're able to see, I think, that this story from the past still has an impact on the modern day, even though the world has changed, even though our perception or dialogue around race has changed, point to Hattie bringing up the points that she does to Cromwell. All of those things have shifted, but yet at its core, the thing that is here is a story about obsession and madness and real life horrors mixed in with these inexplicable cosmic horrors. So getting into the horror, like what I loved is the moments of horror, which yes, there weren't as many of them as I would have liked. But the moments that we had, which we had basically when they meet a woman out in the woods, and then like very hypnotically they presumably have sex with her, Parker and his assistant Bunny do, and that's like one of the recordings, and then a tent show where Bunny disappears and like Parker sees basically some sort of devil figure, and it's really horrific. And then also a jail scene has a lot of really intense, bizarre horror too. Those moments were just so hypnotic and pulled me in so effectively that I just like that they filled at least everything that came after them with dread because they were so powerful for me. So that was one of the big things for me, was that those moments, even though there weren't tons and tons of moments of horror, when I did have it, it had just these ripple effects through the rest of the story that just I still haven't stopped thinking about.
Yeah, I would agree with you to some extent with the horror elements of it. I thought, I think I commented to you, Nathaniel, in a text that this second story was really slow to me, and I was kind of struggling with it. I had put the book down for a while after what the first novella did to me, and so I was kind of getting back into it. And I was a little bored, if I'm honest. And then that Moira scene happens where they're recording her and she just screams, and then they wake up and they're having sex on the tape.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, here we are. This is like the beginning. This is like novella 1. The horror's going to start. And then it just kind of deadpans for, several more chapters. And then we get to that circus scene, and God, that circus scene was terrifying. This giant of a man who's albino and he has sores and he's got his giant penis flopping around, and then he slowly diminishes into a maggot. And I have in our notes that this whole description was set to, literary descriptions of music and guttural chanting and singing, and it was like you could hear the music by reading. And that was mysterious and cool and powerful and really unnerving. And Chiara, I think I texted you at that moment like, oh God, it's starting. Here it is. The second story gets really good again.
Yeah, and that's what prompted me to dive back in. And from there, I finished it really quickly.
But again, and then it just kind of flatlines again until the jail. And then you have that cosmic horror start up again of, Cromwell doesn't really know where he's at. I keep getting him mixed up. Good grief. Parker, he doesn't know what's really going on, and it's the juxtaposition starts to take an effect of, is this reality? Is he imagining all of this? And then for me, after the jail, it didn't get scary anymore. It deflated entirely. I wasn't scared after the circus. I kept waiting for that same resonance, that same horror vibration to hit me, and reading these words and just being so spooked that I was hearing music in my mind that I was just creating from this author's description. And I just didn't get that anymore. And Chiara, I know you kind of had a similar vibe with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, like you've said, the parts that were horror and scary were very, very well written, and they really sucked you in. I did get it a little bit when he finally made it to Cider's End, but I think at that point, when it kind of shifted over to Molly describing what had happened, that's when I really just was like, okay, this is the end, I guess, and it's just winding down from here. But I don't know, there were some things that just, it was underwhelming to me that, or I guess, I don't know how I feel about a lot of aspects of this story. In some ways, I like the things that I don't like, which seems like an oxymoron. But the fact that part of Parker's whole character is that he thought that he witnessed, or his mother had drowned, and he thought that this man that his mother had been with had been the one to drown her. And when he kind of communes with his mom at Cider's End and she says, no, I just drowned, that was so depressing in some ways, because that's kind of what jump-started his whole life. Also, I started to question at that point, because Hattie had mentioned it, did Parker just have syphilis, and was he just going crazy? Like, everything that he was saying in his novel fit kind of descriptions of late-stage syphilis. And when Molly is talking about how Parker looks, he describes that he has sores by his mouth, I think. And that kind of made me, Molly's this ambiguous character where she wrote this thing and her hair had turned white after witnessing it, and so she's supposedly the evidence. But at the same time, I'm like, is our narrator unreliable? Did any of this happen? Was Parker just completely crazy? Did he just have syphilis and went mad? And I think that part of it, I don't know, I wanted it to be very clear that this was real, this was happening, this was scary. And I think at that point I was like, oh, well, maybe it wasn't.
See, for me, like, that is a selling point. I love having that level of ambiguity and, like, hey, I could interpret it this way, or I can interpret it that it was really just, like, straight up evil. And, it's kind of up to me to decide. I like when authors give me that kind of power back, because for sure, like our narrators, all of the narrators in this story are extremely unreliable, especially I think when we're considering how we have Parker is an alcoholic, and he is potentially full of syphilitic insanity and all of that. Yeah, like to me that always feels like a selling point to me. I see why that's not satisfying for everybody, but whenever I encounter that in literature, I always go, yeah.
That's the thing that sets me Googling to try to see what other people think. And I wish I wasn't like that. I wish I really liked the ambiguity, but I just want to know sometimes.
So for me, it wasn't so much the ambiguity at the end with Parker's kind of descent into madness and then ultimately Cromwell's as well. I was really let down that 3/4 of this novella seemed very demonic focused. This story of Stackley, however you want to call it, and then you get this scarlet crown that Parker is searching for, and again we pull in the blood metaphors and this black wall where the king of hell kind of sits behind. All of this very demonic text. There was no real subtext there, unless I missed it.
There is a little bit, but go on.
And then we get to the end, and I feel like it shifts dramatically. It takes a left turn, and all of a sudden it's not about Satan and his demonic forces anymore. It's about this man who's trying to reconcile his past and his sin through necromancy. And the whole point of Stagger Lee was to kneel at this avenging angel and summon Moira, who happened to be an agent maybe of hell who could speak to the dead. It started to crumble apart for me from a demonic standpoint, especially where the emphasis was the Stagger Lee story. And, he's a bad man, Stagger Lee. He's in cahoots with the devil. I just felt like the devil idea was abandoned real quick right at the end.
So I might be able to give some insight on that. So the king that it keeps referring to, because it says that Stagger Lee kills the devil, and then there's like something worse, behind that wall, and it talks about Crimson Crown and stuff like that. All of this felt like it was kind of its own version of the king, or the King in Yellow, which is something that exists adjacent to the Cthulhu mythos. So the King in Yellow is by one of the other big, kind of fathers of cosmic horror, Robert Chambers. But and a lot of people will specifically say it's in the Cthulhu mythos. It's kind of like something to know about kind of a lot of the early cosmic horror writers is that they all kind of played in each other's universes. That's why I think it became so acceptable and so widespread for the Cthulhu mythos to kind of be played with by so many writers, including the writers of the Conan the Barbarian books and stuff like that, where like that's technically in the same universe in a lot of ways. And so Lovecraft actually, one of his evil gods is Hastur, who is supposed to be the King in Yellow, which is Chambers' creation. But the King in Yellow is basically something that is more evil and more powerful than the devil. And so that is, I think, what we're seeing reference to here, is that the King in Yellow is supposed to be the king in hell that is more powerful than Stagger Lee or the devil. And, that is this basic, I think you're supposed to kind of pick up on, hey, even the baddest bad man who could even kill the devil, he is nothing compared to this figure, this, equivalent to the King in Yellow. And so all of those other things are very kind of Lovecraftian, approaches to, oh, well, we're just, communing with the dead. We're doing this little spell. We're just trying to have these like personal things. All of those are, basically good cosmic horror is a very personal story set against this impossible, unknowing level of evil and madness. And so even, the worst man that's ever lived cannot even scratch the surface of the power of the Crimson Crown, the one who actually is behind the wall in hell. Like, so that was, so it I think abandoned kind of the Judeo-Christian hell partway through the story and said, hey, there is basically Lovecraftian gods, or a Lovecraftian god that is so much worse than any of that.
And that's interesting, and I love that. I'm now going to Google Hastur and this figure in yellow.
I'll lend you a copy of the King in Yellow.
I think it solidifies my opinion more, because that is forcing readers to understand Lovecraftian lore on a level that makes them afraid of what's coming. And that's not fair to readers. That's assuming that we have knowledge going into this novella to play into the fear elements. That this, King in Yellow or whatever, the man behind the wall, is this Lovecraftian cosmic entity that I have no idea about, so I'm not going to be afraid of it. You know what I mean?
Yes. I think it's just one of those, it's a matter of audience, right? Like, I think it's one of those things where, because I did have that baseline of knowledge, I was the right audience for those moments to really deliver. But yeah, like, I agree. I wish he would have done more to, I think, explain what he was doing with his equivalent character, so that way it could be more universally approachable. I still feel like those moments were good, but, since, that kind of thing didn't really land for you the same way it did for me, I honestly just kind of feel like it's a missed opportunity, because, man, it landed for me real hard. So that's a very fair critique, where, the accessibility for it wasn't present unless you already had, a certain level of, kind of hardcore cosmic horror knowledge.
Yeah, I wish he would have given us that dread that he established in that first book. I didn't need to know what the cosmic entity was in the first novella to know that it was terrifying and dark. So had he been able to kind of explain that this figure behind the black wall, was stronger than the devil, and he did do that through the Stagger Lee songs in some way, but it was very subtle, and I don't know, Chiara, what do you think, now knowing all of this Cthulhu mythos?
I'm trying to reconcile it. I definitely don't think I thought about it that hard. I thought about it more, I guess, from more of the lens of it just kind of being like a local thing. We talked about Baba Yaga earlier, so I thought maybe it was just kind of this cultural spookiness that was located in the South, and that's kind of the extent of the thought that I gave that. I think one of the things that I struggled with is I'm a very visual person, and it was really hard for me that this story was focused on auditory type things. So I have to confess, with the repetition of Stagger Lee or Stacker Lee over and over in the pages with slightly different changes, because song lyrics are so different from normal poetry, you kind of need that music aspect to carry it. I think that perhaps I just didn't internalize a ton of the building horror that I was supposed to get from the song and the added version, the added verses, and then the crowned and scarlet pieces. Which, I mean, to your point, could just mean that maybe, one, I didn't have the background knowledge to truly appreciate it, and two, maybe I needed a little more hand-holding than I want to admit for this one.
And another thing that actually might explain a lot of the differences in experiences here along those lines is I listened to the audiobook of this one. Like, So, both of you read the text version. And so, yeah, like, to me, the people that were performing both of these novellas, particularly My Heart Struck Sorrow, really had this kind of musicality, and it kind of brought up the natural sort of rhythmic nature of it, because I was listening to it. They didn't, create music for all of the scenes. It was still just the text of the book, but, even just like, listening to poetry versus reading a poem is a very different experience. And so, it's one of those things that I think maybe why it hit as hard as it did for me, and why it was so entrancing for me, was partially because I was listening to it. So maybe the key for anyone who is listening to this and is like, hey, I want to check this out now, maybe get it on audio.
Yeah, you're making me want to listen to it again with audio.
Same.
All right. Well, I feel like we've definitely covered this, and we're honestly a little bit over on our usual time. Should we dig into crowns?
Yeah, I gave it a 5. I know that's really low, but for me, this book did not hit like... My gosh, this novella did not hit me like that first novella. And Nathaniel, you brought up a lot of good points. I have a lot of experience in South America. I did not know kind of this Lovecraftian Hastur god, and I just did a quick Google search, and they are terrifying, and I love them,
yes.
And they will be my new best friend. But a lot of that context, I think, weakened its effectiveness for me. So I give it a 5. The horror was great, but to go back to my first sassy comment, I felt like it only punched me with that horror 2.5 times.
Chiara, what did you give it?
I'm going to give it an 8. I still really liked it. I think this one, for me, reminded me a little bit of Chuck Palahniuk. When you read his books, you always find out a lot about things that maybe you didn't want to know a lot about.
Yes.
This kind of had that same vibe, one with, this folklore aspect, which was really interesting. But then, even just like the acetates with the sound scriber, that was really interesting. And I'd never even thought about how music or records would have been recorded. And I love Chuck Palahniuk. So I think overall, yeah, I would still give this an 8.
I would give it a 9.5. I think that there are, a few flaws, and I think we've identified those. But like I said, I was the perfect audience for this one. I really couldn't love it more. Well, I mean, apparently I could a half a point more, but I've been riding the high of listening to that book for a while. So, moving on to Screams, I guess I can kick us off this time. I gave it an 8.5. Again, I would have given it a higher one if there were more moments of horror, but the ones that it gave me really, really unsettled me, especially that circus scene.
Yeah, I gave it a 6. Those horror moments were so effective. That circus scene really was unsettling and terrifying. I just wanted more of it.
I think again, I would give it an 7. I can't help but think that this would make an awesome movie, and maybe that's just again because I couldn't really appreciate the song portion of it, but just the idea of like the oppression of the heat of a southern summer and the strange goings on. I think the tension would really translate in film. So when I was reading it, even though reading it, I wasn't necessarily getting that, I was still imagining, how grand this could be on screen and how well things would translate that way. So,
or a full cast like audio drama.
Yeah. Yes.
Or even like I want HBO or like Showtime to get a hold of it, because I really think they would capture kind of that severity of this entire book. I remember reading one scene where they're talking about sweating in their car driving down Georgia, I think.
Mm-hmm.
No, in Tennessee, and I just thought like that would be unbearable. I hate getting slightly hot, but to sweat in my car with nothing to do about it, that's the worst.
Yeah. Oh, can before we move on, can I just make one more connection? I think maybe why I was so drawn to this story. Just so, if anyone is unaware, there was a real composer, Scriabin, who attempted to
the unsound.
Yes, he tried to create using things like sacred geometry and lots of mystical things. He tried to make a composition called Mysterium that was intended to destroy the universe if it was played in a certain location at a certain time. And so it just ideas of like music that has like that level of like evil power just is also absolutely fascinating to me. I just kept thinking about Scriabin, and I don't know. It's just another thing that like I'm already kind of obsessed with that kept floating into my head the whole time I was reading this. So that might be part of why I love this so much too.
I mean, there's a ton of lore about, the Devil's Chord, which is a tritone.
Yeah.
It's like C and F sharp, I think. I don't know. I'm not by any means a music theologist or whatever. Theorist, excuse me. Theologist is different. But summoning evil through kind of dissonant sounds. You have the unsound of Scriabin. And then, again, all of this blues and jazz lore about the devil made pacts with these artists so that his music could come through. And we even get stuff like this in the Satanic Panic, like taking your vinyls and playing them backwards. Demonology and music have been best friends since music started, or at least since,
I mean, that's
Christians got a hold of pagan culture.
No, like I mean, I think even before that, that's why so many early music things were, they could only be performed by human voices or things like that, because otherwise it is evil or perverse or profane in some way. So yeah.
Just a quick Google search. I remember this phrase, Diabolus and Musica, the devil in music.
Yeah. Well, how is everyone staying spooky these days?
Chiara, let's make you go first.
Okay. I've always been obsessed with the Let's Read podcast, and basically users submit stories, real life stories that happen to him, and then he reads them in this like gloriously deep voice. And that is my bedtime story. Anytime I'm too stressed to fall asleep, I listen to the Let's Read podcast. And I've probably had a lot of weird dreams because of it.
This explains so much of what you tell me.
I know, I send you a lot of my weird dreams that I write in the middle of the night when I wake up. But I love that. I always have. And then this last week I watched Antlers, which
oh boy,
I have some thoughts about. And then I think, Max, you're probably going to mention these two, but I saw X with you, and then we, around the same time, watched Fresh.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Fresh is on Hulu. It's got Sebastian Stan in it, good old Bucky Barnes from the Avenger movies. This is my nomination right now for Best Horror of 2022. This is a wild ride. It's original. It's spooky. It's unsettling. It's exciting. It's fun. Like, it was just a great time. I watched it and I was mad that I didn't discover this movie because of how good it was. Nathaniel, you have to watch this because it is near perfect for me, this movie.
Oh, it's on the list.
I also watched X. I want to, we live in Utah. It's a very religious demographic out here. X is kind of this crazy sexual ride. If you struggle with sex topics in media, whether that is the portrayal of sex or talking about sex, nudity, anything like that, maybe avoid this movie because it really is talking about sex and how one generation views it and how another generation views it, and how different that is, but also how similar it is. And in that space where that's where the horror comes from. It's bonkers. It's not a perfect movie. There's a lot that is silly with it and ridiculous, but at the end of the day, Chiara, after we finished watching it, we were just kind of enthralled with it. It was this trip of a movie.
Yeah, you're right. It was really original to the point where we had so much to say about it. And I honestly, it's been a couple weeks now, and I had forgotten a lot of pieces about it until you started talking. And then I just had all these images flash through my mind, and I was like, oh man, I want to talk about this.
So good. Nathaniel, you need to watch this one too, because there's a lot of commentary that I think would be fun to talk about. In particular, where the horror comes from.
Yes.
This idea...
Without spoiling anything, but...
Right. You know, because you haven't seen it, this idea of sex, and again, how different it is for different generations, but then how it's the same. We all have a biological need for sex and what that makes us do. So, anyway, it's great. It's bonkers. It's a hoot. The last thing I've been doing to stay spooky is Mark and I, my partner, we watched Ghostbusters 2021 last week.
Afterlife.
Hot garbage. Hot, steaming garbage. Ooh, it made me mad. The female adaptation of Ghostbusters was leagues better than this adaptation. So, I said it, mic is dropped, make your decision. But it just... Oh, it was disappointing. And I love Ghostbusters!
That's so funny. The bar for me for movies, I'm very critical of books, but the bar for me for movies is whether or not I was entertained. And I was entertained by the Afterlife one.
Yeah, see, I was not. Mark and I were just exhausted. We just wanted it to end. And it never ended.
Well...
All right, Nathaniel, you're up.
So I've been staying spooky by reading the House of Leaves teleplays. I think I've talked about House of Leaves on the podcast before. If anyone's not familiar, it is
maybe once or twice. This is like a core identity to you, Nathaniel.
I guess for those of you who don't know, it is a horror novel that I am obsessed with. It plays with the typography in really interesting ways. And so essentially it's about a house that's bigger on the inside than the outside, but it's absolutely terrifying and brilliant. And, it just plays with like how the text appears on the page in really, really fascinating ways. I just recently learned that the author wrote 3 scripts, the first 3 episodes of what would be a television series based on House of Leaves, and I heard that and I said, how is that even remotely possible?
Yeah.
And so I had to get my hands on them. They're available on his website, and they are very interesting. It manages to get into the big ideas of House of Leaves, but also introduces a whole new cast of characters and ideas and plot lines and stuff. It was really, really fascinating. Highly recommend checking out for anyone who loves House of Leaves. So, anyways, that is how I've been staying spooky.
All right. Well, good episode. Thanks for everyone listening and staying along with us. This is a bit of a longer episode, but we were really dissecting two topics today. Mm-hmm. So I think it's well deserved.
Indeed. Well, everyone should, Chiara, do you, want to share where people can find you online, or just keep that?
I'm anonymous. You can't find me anywhere.
Okay. If people want to reach you, they can, I guess, send us emails and we can pass it along?
Yeah, or just chant the poem from this first novella and I'll appear.
Excellent.
I mean, to be fair, even if you chant that, there's a 5 to 10 business day window before Chiara will respond to you. So,
yeah.
All right.
That's true.
Well, thanks for coming back, and I guess for all of our listeners, stay spooky.
Stay spooky.
Stay spooky.
Need even more Scream Kings? Here's our obligatory shameless social media plug. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at Scream Kings Pod. You could also email us at screamkingspodcast@gmail.com. Help us reach a wider audience of horror fans by leaving a review on iTunes or by sharing a link on social media. You can also support the show by going to patreon.com/Scream Kings. Stay spooky.